The house was quiet except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Carlo lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Sleep had been elusive lately, as his mind wrestled with an unease that had been gnawing at him for months. Angela, his wife of 28 years, had become distant, emotionally withdrawn, always distracted. Conversations that once flowed easily between them had turned into awkward exchanges, punctuated by uncomfortable silences. Carlo had tried to ignore it, dismissing it as stress or maybe just the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. There were too many late nights out, too many unexplained absences, too many times she had pulled away when he reached for her. Beside him, Angela stirred in her sleep, her breathing deep and even. Carlo turned his head to look at her, watching as her face twitched in response to some unseen dream. He felt a pang of sadness as he recalled the woman she used to be, the woman who had once made him laugh, who had shared his dreams and ambitions, who had been his partner in every sense of the word. Now, she was a stranger lying next to him. Then, she mumbled something, her voice so soft that he almost missed it. He leaned in closer, straining to hear. "Eric, please babe, not too fast. It's so big, I can't handle it." Carlo froze, every muscle in his body tensing as the words sank in. His heart began to pound, each beat echoing in his ears. He stared at her, trying to process what he had just heard. The words repeated themselves in his mind, over and over, until they were all he could think about. Eric. Not too fast. So big. He wasn't Eric. And she wasn't talking to him. Rage surged through him, hot and overwhelming, as the reality of her betrayal hit him like a ton of bricks. He could feel his hands trembling, not with fear, but with the sheer intensity of the anger that was building inside him. Eric is her close friend. How long had this been going on? How many times had she laid in this bed with him, dreaming of someone else? Unable to control himself, Carlo reached out and shook Angela awake, his grip on her shoulder tight.
Carlo.
"What's wrong?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Get up," Carlo said, his voice low, almost a growl. Angela blinked up at him, confusion etched on her face. "What? Why? What time is it?" "Get up and pack your things," he repeated, forcing himself to sound calm even as his mind raced. "I'm taking you on a surprise vacation." She frowned, clearly trying to make sense of his words. "A vacation? Now?" "Yeah," he said, his smile strained. "Right now. You've been saying we needed to get away, right? Well, here's your chance." Angela hesitated for a moment, then slowly, a smile spread across her face. "Really? A vacation? Where are we going?" "It's a surprise," Carlo replied, the corners of his mouth twitching as he tried to maintain the facade. "Trust me, you're going to love it." Excitement began to replace her confusion. She threw off the covers and jumped out of bed, heading for the closet. Carlo watched her as she pulled out a suitcase and began to pack, her movements quick and eager. She had no idea what was really happening, no idea that every item she placed in that suitcase was just one more step toward her own destruction. Angela turned to Carlo as she zipped up the suitcase. "I'm ready. Where are we going first?" Carlo took the suitcase from her, his grip firm. "You'll see. Let's go." He led her out of the house, the cool night air hitting them as they stepped outside. Angela shivered slightly, glancing back at the house as if she were leaving something important behind. Carlo opened the car door for her, and she slid into the passenger seat, still beaming with anticipation. He placed the suitcase in the trunk, then got behind the wheel. As they drove through the quiet, deserted streets, Angela began to talk, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I've been dying for a vacation. This is just what we need, isn't it? Some time away, just the two of us?" Carlo nodded absently, barely hearing her. His mind was focused on the plan he had started to form the moment she had uttered that name, Eric. The name alone was enough to send a fresh wave of anger coursing through him. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. They drove for what felt like an eternity to Carlo, but eventually, they arrived at their destination, a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement and peeling paint. Angela's smile faltered as she looked around, clearly confused. This is different. Are we staying here? Carlo parked the car and turned to her, his eyes cold. Oh no, sweetheart. This is just the first stop. Angela's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of uncertainty. Carlo, what's going on? Why are we here? Carlo got out of the car, walked around to her side, and opened the door. He took her hand, pulling her out of the car with more force than necessary. She stumbled slightly but caught herself, her unease growing by the second. Carlo? She asked again, her voice trembling now. He didn't answer. Instead, he led her to the room he had reserved earlier that day, guiding her through the dimly lit hallway and into the small, dingy space. Angela looked around, her eyes wide with confusion. Carlo, this isn't. He cut her off, his voice cold and hard. Why don't you ask Eric? The color drained from Angela's face. What are you talking about? Carlo took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers. You think I didn't hear you? Whispering his name in your sleep? Telling him how big his Johnson is? Angela's mouth opened, then closed, as she struggled to find something to say. Her mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, a lie, anything that could defuse the situation. But she was too shocked, too caught off guard to think clearly. Carlo didn't give her a chance. Say hello to Eric, you bitch, he snarled, grabbing her arm and dragging her toward the door. You're going to see him right now. Angela yelped, trying to pull away from him, but his grip was like iron. Carlo, please, let me explain. It's not what you think, and I know Eric is not here. But Carlo wasn't listening. He pushed her out the door and back toward the car. She stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to stay on her feet. Panic overtook her, and she started to cry, the tears streaming down her face. Carlo, please, don't do this, she begged, her voice breaking. Let me explain. But Carlo's mind was made up. He opened the car door and practically shoved her inside before slamming it shut. The drive to Eric's house was short, but to Angela, it felt like a death march. Her mind raced with fear and confusion. What was Carlo going to do? What would Eric say? When they pulled up outside Eric's house, Carlo didn't bother to turn off the engine. He got out of the car, walked around to Angela's side, and yanked the door open. She shrank back, trying to make herself as small as possible. Get out, bitch, Carlo ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. Angela hesitated for a moment, then slowly, she climbed out of the car. She looked up at the house, her heart pounding in her chest. The lights were on inside. Eric was home. Carlo marched up to the door and banged on it with his fist. It swung open after a moment, revealing Eric standing in the doorway, his face a mix of confusion and fear. What the hell is going on? Eric demanded, his eyes darting between Carlo and Angela. Carlo shoved Angela forward, practically throwing her into Eric's arms. She's all yours, Eric. Enjoy your time together. Angela stared at Carlo, her eyes wide with horror. Carlo, no, please. But Carlo was done. He turned on his heel and walked back to the car without another word. Angela tried to run after him, but Eric grabbed her, pulling her back inside. Let him go, Eric muttered, though his voice was shaky. He was just as afraid as she was. Angela collapsed to the ground, her sobs racking her body. Carlo got into his car and drove away, his face expressionless. He didn't look back, didn't care to see what would happen next. His mind was already on the next steps of his plan, the cold, calculated vengeance he would exact on both of them. This was just the beginning. Back home, Carlo paced the living room, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of his emotions. Anger, betrayal, and the desire for revenge churned within him, each vying for dominance. The betrayal had cut deep, but he knew that acting impulsively wouldn't satisfy the cold, calculated need for justice that was growing within him. This wasn't just about hurting Angela or Eric. It was about making them pay, making them suffer in ways they couldn't imagine. Carlo sat down at his desk, the room bathed in the soft glow of the desk lamp. He pulled out a notepad, the paper crisp and clean, ready to be filled with his thoughts. He stared at it for a moment, the the blank page reflecting his turmoil. Then, slowly, methodically, he began to write. One by one, he listed everything he could do to destroy their lives. Financial ruin, social humiliation, emotional torment. Nothing was off the table. The words flowed from his pen like a venomous stream, each idea more ruthless than the last. He didn't just want to hurt them. He wanted to break them, to make them feel the same despair that had consumed him. The next morning, Carlo woke early, his mind clear and focused. The plan was in motion. He picked up the phone and made a call to a private investigator he had used once before. The man was discreet, thorough, and most importantly, had no moral qualms about the work he did. Carlo explained what he needed, every detail of Angela and Eric's affair documented. Pictures, texts, emails, anything that could be used against them. "I'll take care of it," the investigator said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'll have something for you in a few weeks." "Good," Carlo replied, his voice cold. "I want everything." After hanging up, Carlo's next call was to his lawyer. He laid out the situation with a calm detachment that surprised even him. He wanted a divorce, and he wanted it to be as painful for Angela as possible. The lawyer, a seasoned professional who had seen his fair share of bitter separations, listened carefully. "We can start by freezing the joint accounts," the lawyer suggested. "That'll keep her from accessing any of the money. We'll also make sure that any assets in your name remain protected. With the evidence of the affair, we can argue for a larger settlement in your favor." "Do it," Carlo said without hesitation. "I want her to walk away with nothing." The lawyer agreed, and they began to lay the groundwork for the legal battle that would soon follow. For the next few weeks, Carlo played his part perfectly. He pretended that everything was normal, that he had forgiven Angela, even though every word she spoke grated on his nerves. He made a point to be kind, patient, and understanding. The change in his demeanor didn't go unnoticed. Angela was hesitant at first, but the more Carlo acted as though he wanted to work things out, the more she began to believe it. "Maybe we can start over," Angela said one evening as they sat down to dinner. She looked at him with eyes full of hope, unaware of the storm that was about to descend on her life. Carlo forced a smile, nodding as if he agreed. "I think that's a good idea. We've been through a lot, but I believe we can get past this." Angela smiled, relief washing over her. "I've been thinking the same thing. I want us to be happy again." Carlo said nothing, only reached across the table to squeeze her hand. Inside, he was seething. Every kind word, every act of forgiveness was just another piece of his plan. He watched as Angela tried to mend their relationship, putting in effort, trying to please him. She cooked his favorite meals, planned little outings, and even started wearing the clothes he liked. All the while, Carlo knew that the day of reckoning was coming. Finally, after weeks of playing the role of the forgiving husband, the private investigator delivered what Carlo had been waiting for. A thick envelope was left at his office, containing everything: pictures of Angela and Eric together, text messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship, and emails that were even more damning. That evening, Carlo sat at his desk, spreading out the photos and reading through the messages. Each piece of evidence fueled his determination. There was no way Angela could talk her way out of this. She had crossed a line, and now she would pay. Carlo began his assault with surgical precision. The first target was Angela's social circle. With a few keystrokes, he carefully composed an anonymous email and attached the most incriminating photos and messages. He sent it to her closest friends, her family, and even her coworkers. He imagined the shock and disgust on their faces as they opened their inboxes, their opinions of Angela shattering with each damning image. "They've been lying to all of us," Carlo wrote, his words precise and cutting. "They've been using people, manipulating them for their own twisted games. You wouldn't believe the things they've been up to behind closed doors." He hit send, knowing that the message would ripple through their community, poisoning the way people saw Angela and Eric. It didn't take long for the rumors to take root. Everywhere they went, they were met with cold stares and whispered conversations that fell silent as they approached. Angela's friends stopped returning her calls. Eric found himself shunned by his peers. They were no longer just the couple who had cheated. They were now the couple everyone believed was dangerous and depraved. The fallout was immediate. Angela's phone started buzzing nonstop with calls and messages. Confused and panicked, she tried to answer them, but the responses she received were cold, accusatory. Her closest friend, Karen, called her in tears. "How could you do this, Angela?" Karen's voice was full of anger and disbelief. "How could you lie to all of us, to Carlo? I thought you were better than this." "It's not what you think." Angela tried to explain, her voice trembling. "I can explain." "Explain?" Karen cut her off. "There's nothing to explain. We all saw the pictures. We saw the messages. You disgust me." The line went dead, and Angela stared at her phone, her hands shaking. She looked up at Carlo, who was sitting calmly in the living room, reading the newspaper. "Carlo," she began, her voice cracking, Did you do this?" Carlo lowered the paper and met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Do what?" "Send those photos, those messages, to everyone?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Carlo set the paper aside and stood up, slowly walking toward her. "What difference does it make, Angela?" The truth was going to come out eventually. Tears welled up in Angela's eyes. "You said you forgave me. You said we could work things out." Carlo's face hardened. "Oh, bitch, I lied." Angela's breath hitched as the realization hit her. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was the beginning of her downfall. The next step was financial. Carlo contacted the bank, freezing their joint accounts. When Angela tried to withdraw money the next day, her card was declined. She called the bank, only to be told that the accounts had been frozen under Carlo's authority. Panic set in as she realized she had no access to their savings, no money of her own. "What's going on, Carlo?" Angela demanded that evening, her voice laced with desperation. "Why are the accounts frozen?" Carlo didn't look up from the book he was reading. "I'm protecting what's mine. You have no right to that money." "But how am I supposed to live?" Angela's voice rose, panic clear in her tone. "You can't just cut me off like this." Carlo finally looked at her, his gaze icy. "Watch me." The next step was even more ruthless. Carlo collected all the evidence he had, the photos, the texts, the emails, and uploaded them to the internet. He posted them anonymously on various forums and social media platforms, ensuring that the sordid details of their affair would be seen by as many people as possible. There was no going back now. The internet was forever, and so were their sins. The fallout was immediate. Angela was at work when her phone started buzzing uncontrollably. Notifications from Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram flooded in, each one a dagger to her already fragile state. She opened one message and saw the photos of her and Eric, their most private moments now public for all to see. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the comments, vicious, mocking, and unrelenting. Her co-workers began to whisper, and soon, the whispers turned into open stares. The HR manager called her into the office, her face pale with discomfort. "Angela, we need to talk," the HR manager said, her voice strained. "There's been some information circulating about you online. This isn't something we can overlook." Angela felt her world collapse around her. She tried to explain, to deny, but the evidence was overwhelming. She was asked to leave the office immediately, suspended until further notice. The walk out of the building was a gauntlet of judgmental eyes and hushed voices. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the weight of public scorn crushing her spirit. The final blow was aimed at Eric. Carlo had gathered enough information on him to ruin his career. He compiled the incriminating photos, along with emails that hinted at unethical behavior at work, and sent them directly to Eric's employer. Within days, Eric was called into a meeting with HR. "We've received some disturbing information," the HR manager said, sliding a folder across the desk to Eric. "Care to explain?" Eric opened the folder, his face blanching as he saw the evidence laid out before him. He stammered, trying to find the words, but there was nothing he could say that would excuse what he had done. The decision was swift. Eric was terminated on the spot. Eric fared no better. As soon as the evidence hit the internet, his phone lit up with calls and messages. His boss contacted him, the tone in his voice leaving no room for argument. "Eric, this is unacceptable. HR manager also informed me." his boss said coldly. You've brought disgrace to the company. We can't have someone like you representing us. Clean out your desk. Eric tried to protest, but it was useless. His reputation was in shambles, his career destroyed in an instant. When he left the office for the last time, it was with a cardboard box in his hands and the knowledge that his life, as he knew it, was over. Back home, Angela and Eric sat together in stunned silence, the reality of their situation sinking in. They were pariahs, cast out from their community, their careers in ruins. Everything they had built, everything they had taken for granted, was gone. What are we going to do? Angela whispered, her voice trembling. Eric didn't have an answer. He stared at the floor, his mind blank, unable to process the full extent of their downfall. The future stretched out before them, bleak and uncertain, and the weight of their actions hung over them like a dark cloud. As the days passed, the isolation became unbearable. No one reached out to them. The phone calls stopped, the messages ceased. They were alone, cut off from the world they had once known. Angela couldn't leave the house without feeling the burning eyes of her neighbors on her. Eric's job applications were met with silence. They were both trapped in a purgatory of their own making. Meanwhile, Carlo watched it all unfold with grim satisfaction. He had done what he set out to do. He had taken everything from them, just as they had taken everything from him. He had exposed them, humiliated them, and left them with nothing. And yet, as he sat alone in the quiet of his home, he couldn't help but feel a hollow emptiness where his rage had once burned so brightly. He had won, but the victory felt strangely empty. He had destroyed their lives, but in doing so, he had also destroyed a part of himself. The question lingered in the back of his mind, haunting him even as he tried to ignore it. Was it worth it? Carlo stood in the ruins of what had once been his life, a life that had been shattered by betrayal and rebuilt on a foundation of vengeance. He had sought justice, and he had found it, but in the end, he was left with nothing but the ashes of his own bitterness. Angela slumped on the worn-out couch, the faded fabric a stark contrast to the luxurious life she once knew. Empty bottles of cheap wine littered the floor, evidence of her nightly attempts to drown her sorrows. She took another swig, the liquid burning her throat, but it did nothing to numb the pain that had settled deep in her chest. Her phone buzzed on the table, its screen lighting up with yet another message. She didn't need to look to know it was filled with hate. The messages had been relentless. Former friends, co-workers, even strangers had taken it upon themselves to remind her of her disgrace. Each notification was like a dagger, twisting deeper into her already shattered soul. Eric sat across from her, staring blankly at the wall. His hair was unkempt, his clothes rumpled, a far cry from the polished image he once maintained. The weight of his failures hung heavy on his shoulders. After losing his job, he had tried to find work, but every door had slammed shut in his face. His name was now synonymous with scandal, and no one wanted to be associated with him. The shame was suffocating. "I can't believe this is our life now," Angela muttered. Her voice slurred from the alcohol. She glanced at Eric, but he didn't respond, didn't even look at her. His silence was a familiar companion, one that had grown more oppressive with each passing day. Angela's frustration boiled over. "Do you even care? Or are you just going to sit there and do nothing?" Eric's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The anger that had once fueled their arguments had dulled, leaving behind only exhaustion. He was too tired to fight, too defeated to care. Angela scoffed and grabbed another bottle, her hands shaking as she struggled to twist off the cap. "This is all your fault," she hissed, more to herself than to him. If we hadn't." Her words trailed off as she realized there was no point. The blame game had lost its meaning. They were both responsible for their downfall, both complicit in the choices that had led them here. But acknowledging that truth was too painful, so she buried it beneath another gulp of wine. Eric finally spoke, his voice hollow. "Blaming each other isn't going to change anything." Angela glared at him, her eyes bloodshot. "And what's your solution, huh? Just sit here and rot?" Eric didn't answer. He didn't have a solution. He had nothing left to offer, not to Angela, not to himself. The spiral of despair they were trapped in had stripped them of hope, leaving only the bitter remnants of what once was. Angela stood up, swaying slightly as she made her way to the window. She looked out at the world beyond the glass, a world that had turned its back on her. The city lights flickered in the distance, indifferent to her suffering. She pressed her forehead against the cool pane, her breath fogging up the glass. "I wish we could go back," she whispered, more to herself than to Eric. "I wish we could undo it all." But the past was an unchangeable thing, and the future seemed bleak. There was no going back, no undoing the choices that had led them to this place of despair. The only thing left was the suffocating weight of regret, a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. Carlos stood in the spacious new house he bought. He smiled to himself, the satisfaction of his new beginning filling him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. His mornings started early now, a far cry from the lethargic routines of the past. At dawn, he'd lace up his running shoes and head out for a jog through the nearby park, the crisp morning air filling his lungs as his feet pounded the pavement. After his run, Carlo would return home, shower, and prepare a healthy breakfast, usually a smoothie packed with fresh fruits and vegetables. He took pride in this new ritual, a stark contrast to the hurried, unhealthy meals he used to share with Angela. Everything about his life now was intentional, focused, and free of the toxicity that had once weighed him down. Work had become a new frontier for Carlo. He arrived at the office with a renewed energy that didn't go unnoticed. His dedication and sharp focus led to a series of promotions, each one a stepping stone towards the career he had always envisioned for himself. His colleagues respected him, his bosses valued him, and the accolades poured in. Where once he had felt overshadowed and unappreciated, he now stood out as a leader, a man who had turned his life around. Carlo's personal life flourished as well. One evening, Carlo hosted a small dinner party, a celebration of sorts. His closest friends gathered around the dining table, enjoying the meal he had meticulously prepared. The conversation flowed easily, the room filled with warmth and camaraderie. Carlo looked around the table, grateful for the people who had stood by him, who had helped him find his way back to himself. "You've really turned things around, Carlo," one of his friends remarked, raising a glass and a toast. "Here's to new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Carlo echoed, clinking his glass with theirs. The sentiment wasn't just words, it was his reality. Every day was a new opportunity, a chance to live life on his terms. Through it all, Carlo knew that Angela and Eric were watching, their lives unraveling while his soared. But that no longer mattered to him. His happiness wasn't tied to their suffering, it was a product of his own choices, his own determination to rise above the ashes of his past. Carlo stood on the balcony of his new home one evening. As he looked out at the world before him, he felt a deep sense of contentment. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, they were all behind him now, replaced by something far more powerful: peace. Years had passed, and the toll on Angela and Eric was evident. Their once lively house had decayed into a grim reflection of their lives, crumbling, cluttered, and suffocating. The air inside was thick with the stench of stale alcohol, the remnants of their failed attempts to escape the reality they had created. Angela sat on the edge of the couch, her eyes bloodshot, her hands trembling as she cradled a nearly empty bottle of vodka. The walls seemed to close in on her, the once vibrant world now reduced to this suffocating box. She glanced at Eric, slumped in a chair across the room, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He was a shadow of the man he had once been, his addiction having stripped away every ounce of vitality. "Eric," Angela whispered, her voice barely audible, "how did we get here?" Eric didn't respond. He hadn't responded to much of anything in a long time. His mind was too clouded, too consumed by his dependency on the substances that had become his only escape. The silence between them was heavy, filled with all the words left unsaid, the regrets that now defined their existence. Angela's mind wandered back to the days when she had everything: a loving husband, a beautiful home, a career she was proud of. But those days felt like a distant dream, a cruel illusion that had slipped through her fingers the moment she betrayed Carlo. The life she had traded for a fleeting moment of passion with Eric had disintegrated, leaving her with nothing but despair. One night, After a particularly venomous argument with Eric, one that ended with shattered glass and shattered hearts, Angela found herself wandering the streets. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. She was numb, lost in the fog of her own self-destruction. She walked aimlessly, not caring where her feet took her, until she found herself standing in front of the old house she had once shared with Carlo. The house looked the same from the outside, but it was no longer hers. A new family had moved in, their laughter and warmth replacing the cold, empty shell Angela had left behind. She stared at the house, her vision blurred by tears, realizing just how much she had lost. The life she had once known, the man who had loved her, were all gone, and it was all her fault. As she stood there, memories flooded her mind. The nights spent in Carlo's arms, the dreams they had shared, the future they had planned. All of it destroyed by her own selfish choices. The guilt and shame were overwhelming, crushing her beneath their weight. She could never undo what she had done, and the realization was unbearable. Meanwhile, Carlo's life had taken a different path. Free from the chains of his past, he had found love again with a woman who truly valued him. They traveled the world together, explored new horizons, and built a future filled with hope and joy. Every day was a reminder of how far he had come, how much he had grown since the darkness of his past. One day, as Carlo and his new partner strolled through a picturesque park, hand in hand, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. He had overcome the pain, rebuilt his life, and found happiness again. The past no longer held any power over him. But for Angela and Eric, the past was an inescapable nightmare. Angela returned to the apartment that night, her heart heavy with the realization that the life she had destroyed could never be reclaimed. Eric was passed out on the couch, oblivious to her despair. She looked around at the wreckage of their lives, at the man she had once thought she loved, and knew there was no redemption for them. Carlo's revenge was complete, though he no longer thought of it as such. He had moved on, found peace, and left the wreckage of Angela and Eric's lives far behind. They were haunted by their choices, forever trapped in the ruins of what they had once believed was worth everything. And as they languished in their despair, Carlo flourished, his future bright, and the ghosts of the past finally laid to rest.